Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Rémy Ngamije to our At Home with Literati series in support of the Eternal Audience of One, and in conversation this evening with author Peter Orner. As a reminder, for those of you who are just joining us, the chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I will ask a selection on your behalf at the conclusion of Rémy and Peter's conversation. And should you need it, live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. Of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, you can always find links to purchase books from Literati in links directly below me in the description. And you can be sure to subscribe, as more of our events will be posted after they're live. So you can catch up on all of our events, whether or not you're able to attend them at Literati Bookstore, at youtube.com/c/Literati Bookstore. And as a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors, of course, are open to the public for in-store shopping. And most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, late this evening in Rémy's case, wherever and whenever in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author and our moderator. Rémy Ngamije is a Rwandan-born Namibian writer and photographer. He's a co-founder and editor-in-chief of Doc Literary Magazine, Namibia's first literary magazine. His work has appeared in Litro, the Johannesburg Review, Brainwaves, Amistad, American Cordata, and others. He was shortlisted for the AKL Kane Prize in African Writing in 2020. He was also longlisted for the 2020 Furtado Short Story Prize. In 2019, he was shortlisted for Best Original Fiction by Stack Magazines. More of his writing can be read on his website, remythequill.com. Speaking with him this evening, Peter Orner is the author of Maggie Brown and Others, a novella and stories, two-story collection, Esther Stories and Last Car Over the Sagamore Bridge, two novels, and a book of essays / memoir, Am I Alone Here?, a finalist for the National Book Critics' Choice Award. Peter's been the recipient of 3 Pushcart Prizes and fellowships from the Guggenheim, Lanham, and Fulbright Foundations. He holds the Dartmouth Professor of English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth College and lives with his family in Norwich, Vermont, where he's a member of the fire department. Please join us and welcoming Rémy Ngamije and Peter Orner into your living rooms.
Thank you. Peter, I didn't know you are a member of the fire department. Is this gonna put this thing on fire?
I tell you, it's adding a whole new dimension to our conversation. And I'm telling you, if your house is on fire, you don't want me to be the guy that shows up. You want the other guys, but in very last resort, I can hold the hose.
Yeah.
It's so good to see you, Rémy. It's been a while. It has been.
Yeah, no, Peter.
I just want to, first of all, congratulations on the second publication of this extraordinary novel. And we're recording this for posterity, so I'd like you to start by reading, and then I'm gonna follow up with some pretty general questions, because I have questions that I don't know the answers to and I want to know. So this is just personal. But if you could just give people an idea of the book and introduce it in the way that you normally do.
Yeah. So Peter, first of all, it's so wonderful to be here. You and I speak a lot, but we don't see each other a lot. And you've been a part of this book's journey from the very beginning, since you put me in front of a crowd of Namibians who didn't know what was about to hit them. And I read something that got me a little bit of heat and flack, but it was the only way to start the story. And so I will read a part of the prologue, which seems like a faraway year in when was it? 2017 when you were here?
2017, 2018.
2017 or 2018 when you first.
But I remember the moment so well. Here's what I think of you, Windhoek.
Yeah, I will read the prologue, and it's wonderful because it hasn't changed from that first day when I read it for the crowd. And so it starts, the eternal audience of one. Prologue, a long forgotten essay, The Last Ticket Out of Town by Seraphine Turihamwe. Windhoek has 3 temperatures, hot, mosquito, and fucking cold. The city is allowed 2 or 3 days of mild spring weather in early September before the unrelenting heat crowds them out until May. The summers are long and sweaty, so much so that job offers can be sweetened by the promise of air conditioning and an overseeing committee to adjudicate on room temperature disputes because white people do not know how to share. Summer nights are stifling. Cooling breezes heat their curfews and leave the night air still and warm from the day's lingering heat. The departing sun brings out the mosquitoes. They are organized, they're driven. If they could be employed, they would be the city's most reliable workforce. Alas, people do not have my vision. From sunset to sunrise, they make enjoying a quiet drink on a balcony a buzzing and bloody affair. June, July, and August are bitter and cold. An ill wind clears out the gyms. Running noses are the only exercise anyone gets in the winter. The city is called a city because the country needs one, but really, city is a big word for such a small place. But it would probably be offensive to have a capital town or a capital village, so someone called it a city. The title stuck. Life is not hard in Windhoek, but it is not easy either. The poor are either falling behind or falling pregnant. The rich refuse to send the elevator back down when they reach the top. And since cities require a sturdy foundation of tolerated inequalities, Windhoek is like many other big places in the world. It is a haven for more, but a place of less. If you're not politically connected or from old white money, then the best thing to be is a tourist. The city and the country fawn over tourists. The country's economy does too. That is when it's not digging itself poor. That is Windhoek. The best thing to do in the city is arrive and leave. And I'll stop there just for the prologue. And that's where the fireworks started, if I remember correctly, at the reading.
The best way to love a place is to go after it, I think, jugular. And you know, I don't think I felt as much affection for Windhoek. And I read this before you read it, I remember. And I remember even then, like saying, right, you know, finally somebody giving this city its literary due. And you know, and that may not always be pretty, and it may not always be, you know, objectively provable, but nonetheless. Can you talk about the beginning? You know, where this novel, the kernel of it, and what you did with that, the kernel of it, the idea of it. I mean, go way back.
Yeah, I was so looking forward to this, and I was a little bit anxious because I knew Peter, being the master that you are, you'd go right to the heart of the thing and ask me all the hard questions. So I just need a promise from you from the start that I do get a degree in creative writing, because this is about to tax my brain just talking to you.
Yes.
Like I get a degree in Peter Orner, MFA, what?
It's about all it takes to get an MFA in a way.
No, this novel really started from the desire to tell a story. First of all, just a general story. I think all writers want to do that, a story, but just a general story won't be enough because there are many stories in the world. For me, it took a long time to reach the stage where I knew I wanted to tell a story about this young Rwandan man living in Namibia and his desire to to find a place where he belongs. He's in migration. He's clearly left whatever sense of home he has, and he's on the search for this other home, whatever it might be, wherever it might be. And it took a long time to realize that was the story that I wanted to tell, rather than being a story, for it to be the story. It took a lot of reading and a lot of personal self-searching to reach that confidence where I felt like this is the story I want to tell. The confidence in a lot of ways came from the reality of my situation. I could not, despite a long history of reading and watching a lot of things, listening to a lot of things, I could not imagine a fictional New York, a fictional Chicago, a fictional London. It had to be here. It had to be Windhoek, because I'd lived here for so long and I'd observed some things. I'd also seen how it could behave or transpose into literature, into a fictional universe. Because, fictional cities aren't like the real cities as well. And it took a long time to reach that confidence. And I was scared, I can admit, to write about the real Windhoek, because the real Windhoek, I think you need extremely long tenure to understand what the real Windhoek is, but the fictional one, you can interact with as someone who's been here, because you see these things and you hear them, and you can see the challenges this place faces. And so in fiction was a very wonderful place to write and set the story. Once I found that confidence within myself, and once I decided that Windhoek is just as good enough a place for our story as Lagos, as Accra, as Nairobi, then the confidence to explore everything else started from there. But the real kernel was, I wanted to write a story, but I was scared about what I wanted to write about, and then where it would take place. That confidence took a long time to find, and I found it in some of the writing that I was reading at the time. A lot of writers in migration, the way they write about places, you can see they're not outsiders, they're insiders, or they're native sons and daughters, or even if they're not native, they've been in a place so long. And you get the feeling that these people, what they observed was correct. And of course, along this journey, guess what I encountered? The second coming of Marvalashi, Congo. And so it was encouraging, it was encouraging to know that a place like ours could be written about in a way that was humorous. It was amazing to see how someone else's imagination could interact with the place. For a long time, I felt it was impossible. And so in also reading a lot of your works, it was encouraging, because you're like, this is possible.
Was there a particular image that you had in mind? I mean, there's so many, and the details in this book are extraordinary throughout. But I'm interested in I guess the question just basically in the beginning, and then I have a broader question to follow up. But it's an interesting maneuver to make, like having a long forgotten essay start the book. It gives a sense of the character Seraphin as he may have thought about things in the past, and that already, even just I think of the first line being Windhoek has three temperatures. It's not. The first line is a long forgotten essay, and that to me sort of puts me as a reader in a place like, oh, well, this is somebody who's like got a present, a current, and then his like, this is what he was and so it well, I'm explaining how I read it, but what was the impetus behind starting with this? And then I'm gonna go broader.
Yeah, I as a new and young writer who didn't know, I really didn't know what I was doing, and I needed a foundation from which to start writing. The prologue was relatively easy to say. It is a long forgotten essay, because in a lot of ways, prologues, they set the background of a place, even though the story is happening in real time. It might say like previously on this, right, whatever, and that's what happened before, or it tries to summarize everything. And then immediately as the narrative starts, it either starts in the present and then it starts unraveling. In setting it as a prologue, it was a safe place for me to start, because it felt like I've got this off my chest. I don't need to explain everything else anymore. This is still floating in the background. So when something messed up happens to a character or something weird happens, always remember the prologue, the thing in the background, because Windhoek is like that. It hovers in the background. Something nice happens, and then you're like, wait, how did this thing happen? You're like, that's Windhoek. Nice things happen here. And then something disappointing happens, and you're like, wait, but that nice thing just happened. So you have to remember, you're still here, my friend. Right. So that's what it was. It was like a backgrounding of the place, so that I would not have to physically explain every single thing, because I was in danger of that. And I think you've read the first voluminous and absolutely disgustingly long manuscript. I was explaining.
Well, I want to get to that, because that, I think any writer in the room and who might watch this later will be fascinated by how this book reached its present place. Yeah. But just on the fact, just not to belabor the prologue part, but you've written beautifully about the idea of prologues recently, which I read that post. That was great. But it just seems to me like, no matter how Seraphin might try and leave Windhoek in the rearview mirror by starting with it you kind of lay it out that that's not going to happen here.
Yeah.
Windhoek, in his growing up in Windhoek is an integral part of who he is. And that I was talking to my wife Katie, who's also a writer and also a big fan, as you know, about why we both enjoy this book so much. And I think it has to do with, and Katie said this, the idea of elegy. There's elegiac qualities. This book has a great deal of sorrow, certainly a great deal of tragedy, a great deal of weight, right? And yet the overriding sense of it, even in those moments, is of a kind of exuberance, and that exuberance has sorrow in it, right? But this sort of like embrace of life. And I'm just wondering, as a writer, as your practice, how do you see those poles, those emotional, those different, exuberance versus elegy, as being one way of seeing this book?
I think, you've been to Windhoek and you've been to Namibia. It is undeniable that this is one of the most beautiful places in the world.
Yeah.
But it is also undeniable that it is also one of the most challenging. So it is impossible to see Namibia or Windhoek with just one eye and see the beauty and not see the other. So you're always seeing both of those places. This place forces you to see all of those things together. There's the geographic, natural, historical beauty, and then there's also the historical challenge, present difficulties, all of those things. This place has all of those in real time. Bad things happen immediately in the same time that good things happen. There was no way for me to escape that. And in writing that, having lived there for a long time, I guess maybe that means in some way I've taken on this Namibian-ness. I don't know how to not laugh at a very awkward situation that just happened, even though that awkward situation is like, wow, that is deep and dark. But it's also a Namibian way of dealing with our reality. You cannot live in a desert and not have a good sense of humor, because a lot of the things that happen in your life are not funny. But when you think about it from a distance, you're like, whoa, that was hilarious. And so for me, that's how I approach this writing as well. I am very aware that everything has some darkness to it, some challenge to it, some hardship to it. But in the same light, either through those challenges or through those circumstances, there is a possibility for creating beauty. And I thought that was something that I wanted to write and to explore in this writing. And so even if the prologue sounds from the initials like, whoa, that is very hard, later on, as you read, you realize even in around this, there are moments of happiness. It's not all bleak. And that's what, in a way, that's what Namibia is. If you've been through these landscapes, you just go and you can see as far as the eye can see. It's like, it's bleak. And you're like, what is here? Why did people live here? And then you just encounter a moment of beauty. There's like this lone tree on this vast salt pan. And somehow that little tree will be like, oh, this is why. It just, that moment of beauty lends a legitimizing or, a saving factor to the bleakness. And I think that's what, I guess, maybe I can answer your question, that despite all these hardships and whatnot, everything else, there's still beauty in and around us. And I think the best person who I know has ever managed to capture this sentiment was an artist who I really love, Namibian artist called John Warfanger. And he was a woodcarver and he made famous lithographs. A lot of his work is so famous. And my favorite one from his has also become the foundational value of DUK, the arts organization that I started, which says, hope and optimism in spite of present difficulties. Like this man, like, listen, the present difficulties are always gonna be here. They're not going away. But despite all of this, you must still have hope and you must have optimism. And so though that artwork, that consciousness has really sort of like infused a lot of the things that I think about, the things that I do. Yeah, because you've been here, you know how challenging this place can be, but you can't afford to give up.
But it's a beautiful way of thinking about this book too, in spite of present difficulties, because the forefront of that is hope and optimism. And, for that particular artist to have that be the forefront is saying a lot, right? Given what he lives. through.
Yeah.
But you know, your where you come from is Namibia, but also, you know, Rwanda. And I wonder if you could speak to the, you know, to the to that aspect of the novel. And I'm going to actually ask you to read a little bit from chapter 12.
All right. Would you like me to read first?
138. Yeah, if you don't mind. And then you could talk about sort of, you know, the kind of movement in the book, from having, you know, the main character having Rwandan parents and having Rwandan relatives, and that this entire other, you know, and you know, so many of us bring different cultures and different places to where we are currently. And I think this book, you know, speaks in a universal way to that, but it's also extremely specific. You know, Rwandans in Namibia, and then, you know, Rwandan, Namibian in South Africa, right? And in Europe, and et cetera. So go ahead.
Yeah. So page 138, chapter 12. Do you have a specific place you'd like me to read until?
I was thinking through that whole just that paragraph. And there's another one too, which I'll tell you.
Cool. Yeah. Rwanda is a big name in a small country. It is a memory commencing with two loud booms that wake Seraphim up. Curiosity drives him to the next room, whose windows face the street. He hears his mother calling to him. He answers, but stays by the window, trying to find the source of the crackling. His mother comes into the room, desperately calling his name. Then he is bundled into her arms and carried into the corridor. His questions about what is happening are not answered. His parents shush him, and his brothers gently as they drag mattresses into the corridor in case bullets come through the windows of the rooms facing the street. Eve and Eric fall asleep quickly near their mother, but Seraphim is eager to know what is happening. In the darkness, he hears his father rotating the knob of his world receiver, getting static in return. Seraphim's earliest memory of that faraway country is falling asleep on a mattress in a corridor with his parents' hushed voices whispering urgently to each other.
Would you mind reading a little bit more from that paragraph, just when the father comes back with the bread?
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
138. Let me continue. The next day seems to go on forever. It starts with his father and mother waking him and his brothers in the early morning for a hasty breakfast of bread and tea. Then his father whispers to his mother, who clutches his arm fiercely. An argument ensues in muted tones. Seraphim sees his mother sigh and then let go of his father's arm. His father vanishes from the house, and his mother locks the doors behind him. Seraphim and Eve are prohibited from entering any of the other rooms in the house. They can play any games they want as long as they are quiet. Sometimes Guillaume comes home carrying a loaf of bread, sometimes a chocolate bar, which is carefully shared between the boys. At night, when his father and mother think he is asleep, Seraphim hears them talk about curfews, shops being looted, the neighborhood emptying. His father says they are going home, and his mother scrambles around the house, packing suitcases with clothes and what remains of the food. Turimurugo, Seraphim says, we are home. No, Seraphim, to our family home in Gisenyi.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to revisit this aspect? And I don't want to give away too much of the book, but obviously this is incredibly important to understanding our, Seraphim and his trajectory.
Yeah. So, I mean, the story, no Rwandan story is complete without at some point having to deal with 1994. For a lot of world history or people who engage with Rwandans, this is the only thing that they can engage with, because it's the one time it was in the newspapers all over. But there was a Rwanda before that time. Even though Seraphim can only remember to this traumatic moment, there was a Rwanda before that trauma, and his parents come from that place. And so it is interesting because that incident, that time, separates a lot of Rwandans from their, it's a way to, there are two types of Rwandans. There are Rwandans who were in Rwanda before that time and up until that moment, and then there are Rwandans who were born after that moment, during or lived through that moment. And that is really, it shows you the two types of psyches that exist within that demographic of people. In the story, in revisiting this, it was important for me as a writer and as a person who was born in Rwanda, to try my sincerest best to be honest about what it is about what is remembered, because there's also this idea of like, sometimes you remember things that didn't happen to you because you read them or you watched them. And so it was important to paint that in as sincere a way as possible. And the honest truth is that young kids who left Rwanda around that time don't have a lot of memories from before that time. They might remember the trauma, they might have some visions of like their family farms or whatever, but not a whole lot. And they certainly do not have an understanding of what is happening. In writing that, it was, for me personally, it was, I think, one of the few moments when I could actively try and trace back the thing that made me Rwandan, because you are what you are because your parents tell you you are this thing. But there was like this active part of like, wait, I actually do come from here. This is the street that I lived on or whatever. And that was important in not only forming my personal identity, but then also having an ability to stitch that to my present reality, because there was often a long time where I felt like, you know, especially when that weird time where I started living in Namibia longer than I'd been in Rwanda. So now it's like, what are you? Like, because you clearly live here longer than you did at home, but you're still tied to this thing that is home. In writing this, it was a way to explore that narrative, but it was also a sign of respect that it is important for me in diaspora not to write the present history of the people who remained there and who stayed there and who are there and who are in the process of living their own realities that are different from mine and from the characters. It was a big sign of respect. So I think there are at least maybe 3 types of Rwanda as a country. There's the Rwanda before 1994, there's the Rwanda that is present now, and then there's also the Rwanda of diaspora. And that's a different mindset and a different way of being. So Rwandans in Namibia are not like Rwandans in Belgium or Rwandans in the US. It takes on a different mythology depending on where you are. And I had to respect those mythologies as well.
And you can feel that respect in the restraint. I mean, this is a harrowing scene. It's also really beautiful. You know, that's why I focused on the father, you know, kind of bringing the chocolate and, you know, the kind of that in a way that's a more is as heartbreaking given, you know, given what we all know was going on around that house and in that country and in that city and in that place. And of course, you know, there's a scene in a little bit where, you know, where you get a body in the river and you get these images that are familiar, and yet you're telling them from the point of view of Seraphin, which is really singular to him and to his own experience. And to me, one of the most, and again, the book is so funny and so, you know, it is the greatest writing of like text messages and Snapchat and everything that you know all about that I don't, you know, it's so, you capture that different forms of communication so beautifully. But there's, again, this also this sort of backdrop of what this character has been through. Uh-oh, there's a guy mowing the lawn. I better have to go in. I'm in Maine, and the lawn mowing has begun. But there's I just want to point out, or a little bit earlier, and this is in chapter 9, and you don't have to read it, but it's so beautiful. A gathering of Rwandans in exile, also known as a sigh of Rwandans, always winds up being more than the reason for the meeting in the first place. But first come the greetings, the hugs, the cheeks kissings on each side, and then the complaints. It just, you know, again, you know, I mean, it sounds like my Jewish family from Fall River, Massachusetts. It's like first the hugs, then the kissing, and then the complaints. But, you know, the particularity and the universality that goes throughout this book.
Thanks so much for picking that out. That's my favorite. If nothing else is achieved, I just want the credit for calling it a sigh of Rwandans, because I feel like that is, oh my goodness, it is, I think, the most sincere and most sincere observation I've ever seen. There's literally like this sigh that, and I've tried to replicate it with my brothers, but we can't because we're young. You have to be a particular age and you have to inherit the Rwandan sigh. And once that sigh has been made, then like conversation begins. But until, I think it's something you grow into. Rwandan side, and it carries so many things. My mother had a good one, my dad has a good one, and then like when you collect them all in one room, it's like, this is here. And sometimes my brother and I, we used to, it's like, here it comes, bam, there it is. Like, how do we cannot replicate that thing. And I think that comes with life experience. And I love, I love the idea of like creating new collective nouns. So oof, when the world ends, I will take that one. I will run with a sigh of Rwandans.
It's a really, of the many breathtaking sentences, that one, I remember just the first time I read it, like, all right, damn it. There was never any question in my mind how good the book was. And then that, right?
Yeah.
And
it's interesting that you say your family from Sioux Falls is the same in your Jewish
more or less
background. How much of that similar behavior do you think is tied to their lives or past in diaspora? I'm curious.
I mean, my family was removed from the diaspora they were coming from by, my relatives. I'm talking about my grandparents and my great uncles and great aunts, some of whom were born in Russia, and some of them, my grandmother had 6 sisters, and she was the only one born in the United States. The rest of them were born in Russia. And so I think they were maybe closer to that, to again, some of them, I mean, experiences can be parallel and have similarities, and obviously vastly different. And I just think that, I mean, there's something about your handling of, and why I see this book as really an international book, is you're crossing all kinds of borders. And we haven't even gotten into, Seraphin then going, into South Africa and Cape Town, entirely other experience, cosmopolitan, parties, the life. And so can you talk about how that transition? I mean, there's that scene when he gets on the bus to go down to Cape Town. And I just wonder if you could talk about, so people get a sense of the trajectory of the book, which is moving towards that part of it.
Just as I've been talking about how Windhoek has a particular look, there's also a particular attitude that comes when you're coming to Windhoek and when you're leaving Windhoek. And depending on who you are, if you are a person living here all the time, there's a little bit of excitement and freshness. Wherever it is that you're going, you feel like we're leaving and we're going to something new and different. In Seraphin's case, he's excited because it's his last year of law school at a prestigious university, and he's going to Cape Town. Cape Town holds a particular imagination in South Africa, in Africa, and specifically to Namibians. It's such a big, sprawling, complex city with massive challenges, but just like Windhoek, just like Namibia, it's so beautiful. And if you've ever been there or you've lived there for any duration of time, it's a very hard place to let go of. And so the idea of returning is always exciting. It's so weird that this young man always leaves Windhoek and comes to Cape Town, but he always considered Cape Town the return. The return is back home, but he always considers this place to be the return. And that's what Cape Town is to a lot of young people, especially those of us from outside South Africa who have dreamt about studying in this place, working in this place. It captures a lot of I think a lot of people who live in the SADC region, the Southern African region. That place holds such great promise. It's like I think the equivalent is when you leave the big city and you move, it's a small town and you move to New York or something, or what's that sentiment that always echoes in movies, coming to LA to make it. That's what in a lot of ways Cape Town represents. And that's
don't forget
Seraphin is on.
Don't forget Chicago. Just saying.
Chicago, the shy. No, we never forget the shy. We respect the shy.
But what just, and you've had some of the experiences that Sarah has had. You've written actually recently beautifully on autobiography and what that is, what even that question represents when people are conflating the two. But can you talk about what Seraphin's experience in Cape Town does to him as a character, the way you say it?
So I think firstly, for him specifically, this place frees him from a lot of the challenges that he faces at home in Windhoek with his family. And I think there's this wonderful freedom as a young student when you're in a college environment, in a city that you love, at a university you love, and parents and family concerns are far away. You become different. You're a different person around your friends. You're a different person with strangers. And just home is a consideration that's made of it, because in this place, you're suddenly by yourself and you're forming your own character. Cape Town, because of its perhaps a lot of its opportunities, the diversity of the crowds, of the population that is there, allows him to meet so many different people. But in and around all of that encounter, it's interesting to see that whenever he encounters someone as close to him, there's like a repelling factor. It's almost like he runs away from it. But when he gravitates towards someone totally different, someone who has this grounding of like, Cape Town is home, Sunny gravitates towards that. And I think that speaks to his own desire to find a place he belongs. And so I think Cape Town has this way of showing him that, you know, you want to belong here, but do you really want to belong here? And most importantly, as you try to belong here, there are other people who are doing the same thing and they're failing horribly at it. So is this really what you want? Obviously, as a young person, as a young adult, there's no way. I don't think he has the brain power, the emotional maturity to process all of those things. There's just that first spark, that big city spark that just, you must be here, kid. Like, you gotta be here.
But it's a very complicated place,
Yeah,
you know, and the navigation of it, you know, at the level he's at, and you know, kind of who he's running around with. And I mean, there's so many wonderful characters in here, and you know, you do such a good job of sort of giving the life to even minor characters that appear.
Thank you.
And it's a crowded, it's my kind of book. It's crowded with names and with, you know, people who have these lives, each one of them. And one person I wanted you to talk about, and this is sort of random, but I like Maxime. Maxime. I wonder if you could talk. And this is 268. It's just you just, again, it's sort of like you capture the, I mean, you know, your narrator sees the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the gross racism on every level in this place, no matter, you know, Rainbow Nation or not. And yet, again, I think he's always aware of like there being a story beyond just the tragic, just the you know, the horrid pessimism that is very warranted, right? And very real. But 268, I just thought, I got such a kick out of this paragraph about the barbershop. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Would you like me to read or just talk about it?
Sure. 268. Two things were promised: a haircut and a story.
Okay, cool. I'll do that.
Great. I mean, I'm just indulging myself.
Yeah. No problem. No problem. So this takes place in La Belle Homme Barbershop. Seraphine and his group of friends have come for a haircut. Two things were promised at La Belle Homme: a haircut and a story. Everyone who came in for a trim or a cut joined the queue on the couches unless they were elevated to big boss status. A jump facilitated by the size of the tip given to Maxime. As soon as he saw a big boss walk in, Maxime would come over and pull him into a bear hug. He would walk back to his current customer, make his clippers dance and whir, finish the job, and usher the big boss to his seat ahead of everyone else. What style do you want? Something new, or you want the usual? Maxime would ask. Maxime's haircut was an institution, a rite of passage from boy to man, from ordinary mortal to head-turning lady killer. When he was finished, Maxime would pull off the cover with a flourish, like a matador taunting a bull, and make the same joke. I've done what I can. From here on, you are on your own. He was such a fun character to explore, man. Maxime he's also in a way like Seraphine, like that dude who is just doing his utmost best to fit into his geographic location, because he comes from a very challenging background as well, as a lot of immigrants in Cape Town do. But for him, he's also managed to find this weird sense of humor to survive his place. And Maxime is he's a storyteller. that's how he fights back against the mundanity of his life, the challenges that he faces as an, I don't want to give too much, but he's got such a hard situation to confront in Cape Town as an immigrant, but he confronts this by telling stories. Some of them, I've always wondered, I never really concern myself with what is true and what is not in a story. I'm always more about like, but was it told sincerely? Like, did you believe it? Because if you believed it, then as far as I'm concerned, your job as a storyteller is true. And Maxime is that guy. Storytelling is his way of fighting back. And in most of his stories, it's like the hero or an impossible thing happened. And there's something that you feel when a story is being told, and it's funny. And you almost have a feeling that this cannot be true. But in that moment, in that act of listening to the story, there's like a weird sense of community. Does that make sense? And everyone who's in the shop, even though they might not buy the story, they're all sitting and listening and they're laughing. And for that 20 minutes, it's a wonderful sense of community. I don't know whether, does that make sense, Peter?
It makes sense. And it's what the book is all about in a lot of ways. And I one more question about the book. And then I want to talk about like the process of making the book and how this got in the world the way it is. But it seems to me that, Seraphin in Cape Town, he's away from his family, which is really an important part of this. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, and in some ways that the relationship with Maxime and just listening to him, it's sort of like, a way of dealing in the world when you've left your family behind.
Yeah.
But of course, he never really does, and no one really does. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about the importance of family throughout the book.
I think family is this thing that Seraphin's trying to get away from so desperately, because he feels that they're stifling. He feels that they're just not with his vibe. But ultimately, when you think about his trajectory, family is the thing that's allowed him to survive this long. And it's so weird that he's trying to escape this thing that's been responsible to get him as far as he has in life. With Maxime and with his friends, especially his friends, that's like another type of family. But even though they might be chosen or they're brought together by circumstance, they're also another type of family. And it's weird that he doesn't fit in well with either of them. There's always like mini conflicts brewing everywhere. And then with Maxime, living in, he as a storyteller, he takes on he's an older gentleman, clearly, but to Seraphin, he's also, how do I say this, Peter? Would you take advice from your barber? They're the weirdest, sometimes there can be weird characters, but Maxime has transcended that. And so he's like oracular in some sense. And when he tells Seraphin something, it feels like it smacks with the truth. But if someone else tells him this thing, he almost wouldn't believe it or buy into it. And so it's in and around migration, this young man managed to find another sort of family. And even as he joins that other family, he finds the same things that he's running away from this are mirrored in some way here. And so there's no way to escape family unless you first confront those challenges that made you try and leave them in the first place. And I think, I don't want to spoil it, but one of the characters says it best, and this is something that I've realized. Migration won't solve your current problem, it'll just give you a new place to struggle with the same thing. And so that's what Seraphin, I think Cape Town represents to him. It's a false escape. It's a temporary escape, but a false escape. He still has to confront a lot of things in his life, man.
And it's a fun one. There's everybody's having a good time, while I think being aware of just this great weight of what other people are. I think there's an acknowledgement that even while they're partying, that there is a great deal of suffering around there. And in your short stories and in this book, you're the gaze of your first person narrator. And I'm thinking of that wonderful, the night that, the neighborhood watch story.
Yeah.
Where you're just your awareness of what's beyond even the kind of immediate preoccupations of your characters is always there. I think that's again
That's something that I picked up from a writer who you might have heard about. He's like a minor writer, but he wrote this wonderful book, a short story. No, Peter, nothing for me is natural. Everything I've learned from other writers, from other books.
Let's talk about that. Some of your touchstone writers, especially novelists, who has sort of drove you, and then I want you to talk about sort of how the book came from different, how the book had different incarnations, because especially writers can take a great deal of heart in what you did here and how we got here.
Yeah.
I'll start. But first talk, either one, you could switch.
Yeah. I think the easiest for me is a lot of the writers I was reading at the time, and this is especially when you were here as well on your Fulbright, a lot of writers writing in migration. So Adichie's Americana, I remember, was a big thing, and I engaged with that, and a lot of her work as well. Zadie Smith's On Beauty was such an influential book for me because I enjoyed that story. But the way she treats place, she talks about it in an intimate manner. She's not flippant about its descriptions. She doesn't gloss over hardships. She doesn't unnecessarily pay attention to beauty as well, even though the book, strangely enough, is called On Beauty. I enjoyed that book a lot, and I enjoy a lot of Zadie Smith's work. But I think the one that absolutely gave me the thing that you're like, it's cool to read all of these things and be influenced by them, but you need to find the courage to write your own thing, was in 2016 when Marlon James released A Brief History of 7 Killings. That thing broke all the rules that I had been slowly getting over the years and trying to bring to my own work. And it said, look, this is all good and all, but you're still gonna have to write your own thing. Reading isn't writing. And that is how I wound up getting stuck in the writing. I had no idea what I was doing, Peter, from start to end. And I had all of these ideas, and I thought, what if the plot, I was like moving things around here in little, what you call those little yellow squares that you stick on the Post-its. I was like, what if the plot moves from here to here? But I didn't have a narrative voice until I got the prologue. That gave me a place to push off from. And then I didn't know what I was doing. So literally, when you need to describe something, you describe it and over-describe it. One time, one sentence, 2 sentences, just add another sentence on just for good measure. That's how that first manuscript took so long. And it was so long because I didn't know what I was doing. I was figuring things out as I go at a sentence level, like, oh, I need to transition. I need to end this chapter. How do I end? So that first monster that you got was literally me figuring out how the heck to write this thing. The only things that I can tell you that I knew and that I learned and that I picked up from elsewhere was, let's break it down into 3 movements where the story moves between particular acts or whatever, to provide myself with some structure. And then I outlined chapters and I said, this is what's gonna happen. These are the major events in the chapter. It starts here and hopefully it ends here. And then those were like roadmaps for me, but I don't know whether this is something you still experience. You outline, you say, this is what's gonna happen. You get in, and then the language just suddenly starts trying to pull you away from that outline as quickly as possible. New characters jump up out of nowhere. And that was a big difficulty for me because I had no experience with knowing how to end or start narratives, events, that kind of thing. So I just wrote everything out to the best of my ability. When it got picked up, that was the first time from Blackbird Books, the editor looked at it and it was so big. I don't even know how I managed to submit this thing. And she said a piece of advice that has stuck with me since. She said, Rémy, this is cool, but we're gonna have to cut it. And in my heart, I was like, no, it's perfect, but it wasn't. And she said, go back over the work and see where you say something. Don't repeat, don't come back to that issue unless you have something new to say. And then she gave me pointers and said, you have a tendency of over-explaining and repeating. She said, find those yourself and then cut it and then bring that back to me. And then as soon as she gave me that advice, I was like, and I went back and I saw that same manuscript highlighted in red, things that must go, and that whittled down. And then when it came to this version, when Scout Press picked it up, again, these editors are so intuitive, like they dive in with sincerity, and the suggestions they give you, and they say, so they were like, Rémy, I remember Alison, the executive editor, Scout Press, gave me this line: we want your novel to be like a boxer on fight night, when they're trim and they're ready to go after like a 2-week, 3-week, 4-week boot camp or whatever. And they showed me where to manage and, you know, remove some things. And that advice, like, because I learned very well through editing, I was able to act on the advice independently. And then they came in with, you know, with proofreading and all of those things later. But Peter, honestly, this journey has been long, and in and around this process, I've learned more about writing by being edited. As you know, like I'm not a trained writer, so I learn via response, reader reaction, people saying that first sentence was cool, but your follow-up wasn't as strong, or your sense of place was a bit off here. I learned so much during this process, and that's how you got slapped with a 272,000 word manuscript, and the world gets to have.
That how long it was, but still, it was there. It was there, you know, and you know, and I mean, you're speaking as eloquently and as you know, people leave their editors behind. They don't think about, you know, how important they are, and just saying, look, and what you said, the editor at Blackbird said, is so key. Like, you find them yourself, you know, like that is, because that's a hard thing to hear, isn't it? Wasn't it?
Yeah,
hard?
yeah.
I mean,
I didn't
find it myself.
Initially, I didn't like that thing that says we're going to have to cut it. I mean, I understood. Right. From a writer's perspective, you don't understand the consideration publishers go through, but I didn't like that thing, like we're gonna have to cut it. But then she went a step further and empowered me to look for the aspects, and she gave me a roadmap. Since then, that advice has stuck with me with a lot of writing. So now I know I'm gonna write a short story, and I know I'm gonna have to come back. I'm gonna look for places where I repeat, and I'm going to empower myself and cut things. Then I'm going to take the advice that I've been given by any other editor who's ever picked up any other short story, and I'm going to try and work that into the writing. That's helped me in a lot of ways, but it's also steeled or made me appreciate the craft of writing so much more. And now I enjoy talking to people about craft because I'm just interested in learning as many things as possible. Yeah.
I think John might have a question, and
the
end of our rainbow is coming.
We have one question from the audience. I think we have time for one question. So a viewer writes in to Rémy, were you always a big reader, and who was the best storyteller growing up?
Oh, okay. I've always loved reading, and I think Peter also knows the story that the Windhoek Public Library was the first place I'd been to in the world where I was never asked where I came from. Like, they never asked me for paperwork. They never asked me. They just said, oh, look at this bunch of kids who's here, because my siblings and I used to be taken to the public library after school. It was like our informal daycare, and we just like reading, so they gave us library cards. And that was like the first sense of belonging that did not come with discrimination. And so I always loved reading. I loved going to the public library. The first books I remember that I could read by myself were the very books that were read to us when we were in the second grade, when we were learning English. So that is all the Roald Dahl novels. Like we love those things. I still have a lot of them on my bookshelf. I still have them. Those were my favorites growing up. And then, because I liked humor a lot, I think the hands down the writer whose style I've loved and envied, that's the wrong word, loved the most, is Terry Pratchett. Because this man's sense of humor is ruthless, and it is so funny, and it is so good. And I've read his Discworld novels over and over. And then writers in and along that vein as well, because I enjoy a lot of Paul Beatty, who wrote The Sellout and The White Boy Shuffle. Oh, I love that stuff. But there's another writer who you might not have heard of, who wrote this amusing book called The Second Coming of Marvalashi, Congo. So Peter is a very shy person, but you know, he's also a person whose writing I look up to. And there's a specific chapter when the piano arrives, I reread that chapter so many times in that book, because I'm like, this is it, guys. If you ever want to know how to set up a comedic scene, this is it. And so his writing has informed me a lot as well, especially short stories, because I learn a lot from reading his works, and a lot of other writers as well, because these are people whose like sense of craft is high. And I joke with Peter and I say it's con artistry, but man, like I love these writers because they write so well, and I can't figure out the magic behind them. Like, how did they create the scene? And that's where the pleasure of reading comes from. And Peter's work, I have his whole collection, everything I've read. So it's an honor for me to be here with him, because this is a man whose writing skills.
You embarrass me, but I gotta say, like, that's such a beautiful shout out to the Windhoek Public Library, right?
Yeah.
Not a place that gets a lot of love from anybody. Certainly not the municipality that underfunds the place. Right?
Yeah.
And I found some weird stuff in there. Like I once got locked in the bathroom there. That was harrowing. But also like the stamps in some of the books from the old apartheid days, really creepy shit. Like in there. But,
I mean,
the place soldiers on, and I just think, you know, when in your fame and riches from this novel, I want you to help the Windhoek Public Library.
Always, no, our projects always involve a big part of like the public library, and we have future plans going forward, as well as Duke as an arts organization. But what you're talking about, I love going to the library because I love seeing when last a book was borrowed. Because some of these books you check and you see the stamp and it says 1972, and you're like, wait, nobody has borrowed this book since 19.
Definitely not
amazing.
I wanted you to talk about Doak, but I think we might be out of time. But John, how are we doing? I mean, I don't want to.
Well, we are running low on time. I mean, not that we have the hard out or anything, but there is one more question that came in, and I think maybe we could end on that. It's a great question. Rémy and Peter, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Rémy, can you speak a bit about writing from places where people have no imaginative capacity for, and inviting them to that space?
Wow, I'm about to get my MFA here, John. Watch me. This is my dissertation. No, writing from here, and I will use Windhoek as my context so that I don't seem like an authority on this thing. But writing from here was hard, and it still remains hard. But in writing from this place, I cannot lie to you and say that it was freeing to not be writing from Lagos, to not be writing from New York, to not be writing from Nairobi, to not be writing from Cape Town, because all of those other places have writers who are adding to these places mythologies and imaginations. And those things sometimes come with burdens, with expectation. So we always joke about Nigerian writers and their Harmattan winds. And we're like, oh, here comes the Harmattan wind, because it must be there. And so it was freeing for me to be writing from Windhoek because it was new. It hadn't been explored a lot in literature. It didn't have a space in the literary world, and I was freed from those burdens or expectations. But at the same time, it was challenging because if by some miracle this thing got picked up, it would be the first, and I didn't want it to be authoritative. So there's deliberate leaving of space for other writers to add their imaginations. And I think through the writing, I try to stress that this is a person's perspective and not the encyclopedia entry of what this place is like. In inviting other people to participate, for example, with the literary magazine, that is an active fight. So it's weird, it's like an active fight against the story that I've written. So I've written this novel that's cool, it's in the world and everything else, but we're also catering and trying to get all of these other Namibian writers to add their voices, to either contradict or add, but ultimately increase the imaginative capacity of this place. For me, the real goal is to not have a sense of like ownership about I am the only Namibian writer, and therefore this is what this place is like. No, it's about adding more people to the space, because you get a richer and more complex and nuanced view of a place when more writers are actively contributing to that space, not being insecure that they might contradict your vision or stuff like that. It's the more the merrier for me, because I think it's what this place needs, it's what this space needs. And I hope I have done a successful job of defending that thesis question. That was so wonderfully broad. Like I could see myself walking to a place and having to defend that thesis. It was so complex.
I think that's a beautiful answer, Rémy, and a wonderful place to end. So Rémy Ngamije, Peter Orner, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home of Literati. I hope we can have you both in the store.
Can I read one?
Oh yeah,
sentence
please.
from this book? Just one sentence. When Seraphin finally survived the Angelica apocalypse, that's one word, he took a sabbatical from all things reproductive for what seemed like a respectful duration. Anyway, the poetic dancing that you do is remarkable. I just wanted to put that out there just so people get a sense of sort of the what you are inventing, which is basically kind of your own language in a lot of ways. And as you say, you're opening up space for other Namibian writers, other writers from SADC countries, other writers from everywhere. But at the same time, your singularity is like yours and yours alone. So
thank you,
I just
Peter.
wanted to say that. Sorry to interrupt you, John.
I appreciate it, Peter. Thank you for honoring me by being here tonight, for taking time out of your schedule to just speak with me. We miss you out here, man. So whenever you're back here again, you'll find a warm welcome. John, thank you for arranging this, doing all the tech stuff. And if you're ever out here in Windhoek, I'd like to show you our 3 temperatures, John.
I'd be thrilled to. I'll look you up when I'm there.
Yeah, hopefully by the time you land, we might have one more. We'll see how the world goes. Thank you
I hope not.
For making the time for this platform, the Literati Bookstore, for just inviting me. I love your work, and I follow you guys on all the platforms. So thank you so much. You guys are doing wonderful, wonderful work. We hope to maybe in the world that is to come, be able to join you guys in the similar endeavor, curating voices from around the world and giving them platforms like this. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Rémy. Thank you both. This was a wonderful evening, and we'd welcome you both in the store for a second round in the world to come as well.
For the paperback.
That's right.
In Ann Arbor. See you in Ann Arbor.
Right.
Next year.
Peter is a salesman. Peter is such an aggressive salesman.
I'll see you in Jerusalem. We'll see you in Ann Arbor next time. So, anyway, so good to see you, Rémy. Get some sleep. It's late there. And John, thank you so much. And
thanks, guys. Take care. Have a great night.